I was hesitant to make this breakdown video because I made some poor technical decisions. I made it anyway because I think it is still worth demonstrating, given how many little details make up the effect and that the end result is pretty satisfying. Along with breaking down the effect, I will cover those technical mistakes and explain how I might build the effect differently now. My effect uses a large variety of nodes. Particles are used to render debris, 3D sprites are used to play my explosion animation, audio emitters are used to play sounds, omnilights are used to emit the light coming from my explosion, but the most important node I use is the animation player. It coordinates all the other nodes and cleans up the effect when it's done. There's a script attached to the root node of the explosion that controls little details that'd be too tedious to animate. This is the explosion scene. I separated the effect into two stages, pre-ignition and ignition. While in the pre-ignition phase, I render sparks and smoke as if coming from a fuse. I wanted my sparks to look like they were emitting light, so I used a 3D omnilight that changes position, energy, and attenuation every frame. The actual explosion and cleanup of the effect occurs in the ignition stage. The effect starts in the pre-ignition stage. I switch between the stages programmatically by calling an explode method. I staggered the spacing of the sprites to ensure that specific sprites render in front of others. The camera shakes a little when the explosion happens. That's because my character controller has a camera shake property that is used to randomly set the offset of the game's camera every frame. This was the reference I used. If you're creating your own explosion, I highly recommend checking this one out because it highlights all the important details of the explosion. I provide links in the description. This is my kinsugi scene. Kinsugi is the Japanese art of repairing broken pottery with a gold-like substance. In my game, crate pieces weld themselves together in an intense blaze. I achieve this effect using a shader. I expose a property of the shader called progress, which controls the stages of the effect. I programmatically interpolate this value via the tween node. I do this with a duplicate version of the shader material, so this interpolation isn't performed on every instance of the shader. I'm excited for Godot 4.0 because it adds per instance uniforms, which allow users to tweak shader parameters per each 2D and 3D node. This means I wouldn't have to duplicate the shader material anymore, which would greatly simplify the code required to render my effect. I used Houdini to shatter my crate and set the materials. I assigned materials by using a bounding box that covers the faces belonging to the cracks. I would show you my Houdini scene, but it's on a school computer, which is inaccessible to me right now. I mentioned I had gripes with the technical aspects of the effect. For one, both stages of the explosion are coupled together. This means that if I wanted to use just one stage of my effect, I would still be loading all the assets needed for both, which would be wasteful. A better implementation would involve separating the two stages of my effect into two smaller effects, so each stage could be used independently. The other big problem is that I add my explosion effect to projectiles by instancing them as children to the projectile. Because of this configuration, I had to script the effect to reparent itself so it doesn't get deleted when the projectile frees itself. This kind of code is very messy because my explosion will reparent itself whether I want it to or not. I think the projectile should be completely responsible for instancing and positioning its effects, because it is so much easier and safer than making it the effect's responsibility. For example, I can easily avoid destroying the effect when I free the projectile by instancing the effect as a sibling to the projectile. GDscript and Godot's simplified shader language ease the burden of adding logic to effects, but please avoid my mistake of overcomplicating your effect. Effects shouldn't be coupled together. They should handle their own destruction, but not their own spawning. I hope this breakdown is useful for you. If you have any more questions about my effect, please ask them in a comment. If you are interested in seeing my reference or the Houdini tutorial I mentioned, please check the description. Thanks for watching, and I hope to talk to you again soon.